Committee will come to order. Committee meets today to continue to examine the defense acquisition system to improve its agility so that we can get needed capability into the hands of the warfighter faster. Critical to getting our troops what they need is starting programs well, which is the title of today's hearing. Too often, programs start the acquisition process in an unstable position, beginning with significant technical and programmatic risk. And unfortunately, this leads to delays, cost overruns, performance shortfalls, and as we've seen all too often, cancellation of programs. Many argue that the stovepipe requirements, budgeting, and acquisition processes contribute to this problem and that better aligning these three could shorten, simplify, and improve our acquisition system. Also, it's important to make hard decisions early about achievable requirements that balance affordability, capability, and speed to force. Starting programs well was the focus of a lot of the reforms we made in last year's NDAA, but getting the early steps right is critical to further improvements. This morning we're privileged to have three witnesses who have had considerable experience in the course of this process. And since all of them have been here to testify before, I appreciate their courage in coming back to testify now that they have moved on to other pursuits. Both Ms. Fox, Mr. Hale, and Admiral Winnefeld have been very involved in the cost estimation, budgeting, and requirements process. And so we look forward to their insights about further steps that we can work with the department on to further improve this acquisition process. In the absence of the ranking member, I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis, who is taking his place today.
Thank you, very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you. As the chairman stated, I think our witnesses today are very well suited to address us on those issues, having served in the Pentagon, having been through, I guess, the highs and lows on a number of acquisitions, and we certainly wish that you will share with us as forthright and honestly as you can what goes well and sometimes what doesn't go so well. What are those lessons learned? It's important for us to really take a close look at that and be sure that we're doing everything that is the most efficient and the most agile in terms of acquisition, but at the same time encouraging people to innovate and even to take risks where that's appropriate. Sometimes that whole concept of being free to fail is something that often is not discussed as well as I think it should, and we know that there are certain areas in which that is more possible and others in which it certainly is not. I think we also want to get your thoughts on the impact of Congress, where we're constantly changing the acquisition system. We know that each year a portion of the NDAA, known as Title VIII, includes dozens and sometimes hundreds of pages of new law. And in last year's bill, for example, both this committee and our Senate counterparts added around 75 multifaceted and detailed new acquisition laws. So while this annual effort to fix the acquisition system is well intended, there is certainly a chance that these constant changes in the law could be making it more difficult for DoD to make good decisions on programs. We welcome your input today and look forward to what you have to say. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The committee is pleased to welcome Ms. Christine Fox, who formerly was Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. She's currently affiliated with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Mr. Robert Hale, formerly the Comptroller of the Department of Defense, currently affiliated with Booz Allen, and Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is currently teaching at the Sam Nunn School and also associated with the Kennedy School up at Harvard. Again, thank you all for being here. Without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record, and now you'll be recognized for any comments you'd like to make. Ms. Fox.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry, Representative Davis, and distinguished members of this committee. First, I appreciate all of the work you have done and continue to do on acquisition reform, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today on this important topic. During my tenure in the Department of Defense, my colleagues and I spent considerable energy to improve the affordability and feasibility of the major defense acquisition programs. In my current position at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, I have the pleasure of working closely with scientists and engineers who are innovating with technologies that will enhance our nation's security. My full statement has been submitted for the record. I'd like now to summarize briefly its major recommendations. First, I would emphasize the importance of continuing to require independent cost estimates for major programs. When I became CAPE Director in November 2009, many weapons programs were in the red for both cost and schedule, some of which eventually breached Nunn-McCurdy thresholds. The reasons are varied and unique to each program, but a common factor was a strong want and need for the program, coupled with institutional incentive to be overly optimistic. In short, they thought, this time will be different. But these optimistic assumptions rarely became reality. The Weapons System Acquisition Reform Act of 2009 changed all that by forcing the department to have an independent cost estimate developed by CAPE for all major program milestones and at certifications for programs experiencing cost overruns. No longer could the department base program decisions just on the projections of a program's most ardent advocates. Sustaining the progress of recent years will be all the more important as the department implements the acquisition reform provisions of the fiscal year 2016 NDAA, which moves milestone decision authority to the military departments. One recommendation I can offer this committee is to amend the law to ensure that CAPE continues to provide independent cost estimates for all programs for which they currently have responsibility, regardless of where the milestone decision authority resides. Another key factor in starting programs well is getting the requirements right. My colleague, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, when he was the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, took significant steps to ensure that CAPE and AT&L had a voice as requirements were debated at the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. For example, technology maturity is now as much a part of the requirements discussion early in a program's life cycle as is cost and schedule realism. This important collaboration really should continue. With respect to the acquisition workforce, while much progress has been made, I am still concerned that too often program managers are incentivized to get their program to the next milestone, regardless of whether it should go forward. No one wants to throw up bureaucratic roadblocks and unnecessary delays, but program managers must have the experience and confidence and encouragement to stand up and tell hard truths when needed, that it's not ready to go to the next milestone, or maybe it's never going to be ready, or even we don't need it anymore. In all, process improvements led by AT&L and the Joint Staff are allowing us to design and field programs more efficiently and effectively, but it still takes time. In the FY 2016 NDAA, the Congress has made important changes to facilitate rapid prototyping and fielding of new capabilities. We must also consider ways to develop DoD-unique technologies and keep them at the ready, on the shelf, for the day when the nation has an immediate need and/or when the budget environment changes, as it certainly will, I hope. In addition to working with industry to prepare for these transitions, the promise of advances in manufacturing would give us the ability in the future to take a technology from design to production on demand in the future. We must continue to pursue these types of initiatives. Now, to be sure, we wouldn't accept a rapid prototyping, tech-on-the-shelf approach to build, for example, the Strategic Nuclear Submarine Force. For those large programs, we are pushing out risk and are increasingly following a realistic and achievable path to procurement. But what if we are not taking enough risk in our technology development? In today's world, Our potential adversaries are rapidly fielding new technologies that might require us to push ourselves in certain select areas. Perhaps we need to knowingly take risk. This should be a new category of acquisition programs in which we push the boundaries of our technologies with full awareness and acceptance of the inherent cost and schedule risk. In my view, this is an acceptable approach only if there is an agreed-upon need and we are candid in our assessments of the risk. In closing, the worst outcome in all of these areas would be for the department to be allowed to go back to the days of believing in magic with regard to cost and schedule. With prudent risks and proper controls on cost estimates and requirements, the department's acquisition system will provide better outcomes for both the warfighter and the taxpayer. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you. Ms. Hale.
Chairman Thornberry, Ms. Davis, and all the members of the committee, I appreciate the chance to be here. I'll talk today of the budgetary aspects of acquisitions, starting with discussing acquisition unit costs, but I'll focus particularly on the need to control operating and support costs. It's so important that I believe it should be the next frontier for acquisition reform. Before I turn to those topics, I would like briefly to comment on the effects of budgetary turmoil in the Department of Defense. Since 2010, DoD and many other agencies have seen near constant budgetary turmoil, sequester, shutdown, furloughs, continuing resolutions. We all know the list, and it is frustrating. It has bad effects on program management in the department, takes away time that senior leaders could better spend on things like acquisition reform. It wastes money. It damages the morale of DoD employees, especially civilian employees who make up a lot of the acquisition workforce. I would ask everyone on this committee, I would plead with you to do all you can to get back to a more normal budget process. Let me turn now to holding down. I'll start with unit acquisition costs by starting programs well. For many years, DoD has seen relentless growth in the unit costs of its programs. It's typical for, as we go from one generation to the next generation of a weapon, to see growth of a factor of 2 or more even after adjustment for inflation. Some of these higher acquisition costs led to improvements in capability that were needed to keep up with potential adversaries. However, the higher acquisition costs, especially when you combine them with the operating support costs I'm going to discuss in a moment, forced the department to reduce the overall size of its forces. If we want to avoid further force cuts, then we need program managers to make hard trade-offs early in the life of a weapon, first to set baseline costs that are consistent with likely future budgets, and then to try to ensure that there isn't unanticipated growth in costs above those baselines. Both of those efforts are needed. In recent years, the department has made significant and I think commendable progress in holding down unanticipated cost growth. That cost growth has slowed. We've seen fewer violations of the Nunn-McCurdy thresholds. But the department also needs to make those hard trade-offs to get reasonable baseline costs to start with. That is why I'm glad to see that DoD is establishing what it is terming affordability caps. It described them in the September 2015 report on the performance of the acquisition system. These affordability caps cover both acquisition costs, but also sustainment or operating and support costs. So they cover the full life cycle costs of a weapon system. According to that September 2015 report, we've seen 29 caps established for major defense programs, organizations set up in the services, as well, I believe, as in CAPE, to monitor efforts to do this. I'm hopeful that DoD will use these affordability caps as a vehicle for continuing to monitor and try to hold down acquisition costs, so long as we're consistent with assumptions of what we need to meet the threats. I focused so far on DoD's efforts. I'd like to note Congress is also playing a role here, especially in last year's authorization bill. He made a number of changes, some of which may help hold down acquisition costs. I note, for example, involving the service chiefs more in the requirements process. They at least will have a sense of budget problems. Let me turn now to operating and support costs, which are very important to the department from a budgetary standpoint. Operating and support costs make up more than half of the total cost to buy and operate a weapon over its life cycle. They also make up today almost 2/3 of the total defense budget. They are so important, or controlling them is so important, that, as I said, I believe they should be the next frontier for acquisition reform. In recent years, these operating and support costs have grown sharply, even as force sizes decline. If you take operating and support costs, and by that I mean the dollars in the operation and maintenance appropriation of military personnel, you adjust them for inflation, take out wartime Morocco costs, they've grown by 20% since the year 2000. At the same time, the size of the military force, as measured by the number of active duty personnel, has declined by 4%. So what's causing, and I should say this trend occurs in all the military departments, and it didn't just start in 2000, it's been going on for decades. So what's causing operating and support costs to grow, and what can DoD do about it? Some of the growth in these costs is not directly related to weapons. It's related to programs or issues like military compensation and health care. Working with the Congress, the Department of Defense has had significant success in slowing the growth in health care costs and in compensation costs. More effort is needed. I'm pleased to see that Congress or key members have indicated they will tackle military health care reform in this session or an upcoming one. We also need to look at hard issues like closing unneeded facilities and continued efficiencies. A substantial part of operating and support growth can be tied directly to weapons. So while DoD has devoted much attention to controlling and holding down acquisition costs, it has not yet paid as much attention to holding down operating and support costs. The new affordability caps, which I mentioned earlier, include, they call them sustainment costs, but it's essentially operating and support costs. I very much hope they provide the department with a vehicle for working to control these costs because of their budgetary importance. Congress can also play an important role in slowing the growth of operating costs. For example, Congress can use hearings. I'm amazed I'd come here and ask for a hearing, but I'm out now, so I agree with that. I think it would be especially important for this committee and other defense committees to hold hearings on the implementation and enforcement of these affordability caps with a focus on the operating and support portions. Congress can also use reporting requirements to shine a spotlight on operating and support costs. The Nunn-McCurdy legislation requires reporting on weapons programs that breach thresholds for unit acquisition costs. And I know from personal experience sitting in staff meetings, these focus the attention of senior leaders. It's time to consider similar reporting requirements for operating and support costs. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, in some program managers supervising DoD weapons have a lot on their management plate, especially early in the life cycle of a weapon. But during that period, they do need to consider trade-offs between requirements and costs and pay attention to these affordability caps if we are to sustain reasonable levels of forces. And they particularly need to focus, in my view, on operating and support costs. It should be the next frontier for acquisition reform, and given its budgetary importance, it's critical that we conquer this frontier. Mr. Chairman, that completes my remarks.
Thank you, sir. Admiral?
Good morning, Chairman Thornberry and Ms. Davis and members of the committee. Believe it or not, it's good to see you again. And I thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to contribute my thoughts on the important topic of acquisition reform. It's also a pleasure to appear alongside two of my long-standing former colleagues of whom I think so highly. As we approach this very important topic, I think we should be mindful of the fact that acquiring the tools that DoD needs to protect the American people is not an easy task. We're talking about conceiving, designing, budgeting, prototyping, building, testing, adjusting, and evolving the most advanced technology around, and not doing it on the scale of the iPhone. It isn't easy, and it isn't cheap, and it isn't always fast. Though some nations do it faster than we do, and some do it for less money, nobody produces a better final product than the United States. And when some pretty capable people from both government and industry are trying to do this immensely complex task in a cost-competitive environment, within a chaotic budget environment, with a rapidly evolving threat and a quickly evolving technical landscape, it should come as no surprise that we sometimes have cost, schedule, and performance challenges. That said, there is no question that we can do better, and we are doing better, but I also applaud the committee for the attention that you're giving in the interest of good stewardship of our taxpayer dollars and our readiness to fight. My participation today really regards the front end, the requirements process, and most specifically the joint requirements process, where I believe we've made some pretty solid progress. Specifically, during the 4 years that I was privileged to serve as vice chairman and oversaw this process, we did the following. We sped up the joint document process by dramatically shrinking the size of our documents and by compressing the time allowed for our stakeholders to review them. For example, initial capability documents that were once 200 to 300 pages are now limited to 10 pages. What once took 6 months or more to approve in an initial capability document is now limited to 97 days, which sounds like a lot, but there are a lot of wickets they have to jump through. We also worked hard to inculcate the provisions of the 2009 Weapons System Acquisition Reform Act, which was a good piece of legislation, into the requirements process, including bringing cost, schedule, and technical maturity considerations into joint requirements deliberations. We actually considered those as factors. We shrank the Joint Requirements Oversight Council meetings from an auditorium full of people to a much smaller group in a much smaller room. And we really leveraged what the WSARA asked us to do, and that is our outside experts, our AT&L experts, our Comptroller expert, our USD policy experts, our CAPE and DOT&E experts, specifically asking for their advice in every single meeting. And I think they would tell you, as Ms. Fox said, that they felt like they were included in that process. We formalized the Joint Emergent Operational Needs and the Joint Urgent Operational Needs requirements processes and executed them both with discipline and dispatch, taking only 15 to 31 days for the whole requirements process to run its course. We worked with our CAPE partners to speed up the analysis of alternatives process, including experimenting with doing the work ourselves rather than putting it out for contractors to do it. Whenever it was appropriate, we took a portfolio view rather than looking at capabilities in stovepipes, and we started including special access program capabilities into that process, which was very important. And while ensuring the COCOMs knew that they were welcomed as members of the JROC, we also imposed discipline on their integrated priority lists to ensure they reflected capability requirements, not just requests for more capacity. During my tenure, not a single joint requirement grew. In fact, working with program offices, we actually trimmed a few that made sense for the warfighter and saved money and heartburn in the process. We even instituted quarterly meetings among the requirements, acquisition, and budgeting leadership. But because there were so few issues, because we think we were getting that process under control, we really never had a contentious discussion. And we were transparent. To my knowledge, we never once have turned down a request from Congress for a copy of a JROC document, which I think is important. I don't want to monopolize the time by talking too much in detail about the provisions of the 2016 NDAA. There are some good ideas in there. You've done some good work. There may be a few that are legislating what's already working, but that's okay. I would say that we were asked to have the JROC strongly consider the service chief's views in the requirements process. And I'm not sure where that came from, because kind of like the Geico commercial, if you're a JROC, it's what you do, is consider the chief's views. That's why it exists. I also support the strong service chief role in the milestone decision process. But I would flip it on its ear and say this is less about giving them something they never had. And I think this is what you intended, by the way. Less about giving them something they never had than it is holding them accountable for something that they already had and could do anytime they wanted, and some of them were actually good at that. I couldn't agree more with the initiatives you have to enhance rapid prototyping. It's the only way we're going to keep our competitive edge in a dynamic world. And without causing more confusion in the process, I think we need to look deeper into how we institutionalize rapid prototyping so we don't end up with 1,000 different flowers blooming and we have a little bit of control over the process, which I think we have, but we might be able to do better. I would like to see some funds specifically set aside for it, and that perhaps even for the Deputy Secretary and the Vice Chairman to control those funds. Because there are sometimes things that the joint world needs that the services just don't love enough to make it into their budget process. But I also would tell you that I think it would be a mistake to fund something like this with a penalty for cost overruns. For one thing, we'd like to get rid of cost overruns, which would mean there would be no money for such a program. And for the other thing, I do believe it could cause some unintentional bad behaviors if you start penalizing programs for cost overruns. We want to limit those as much as we can, but you could have some odious behavior in the process of trying to do that. Absolutely agree with the legislation's emphasis on better development of acquisition professionals. I would ask that we all be cautious about adding more reporting requirements. We have enough paperwork. And I also think we need to keep a sharp eye on the testing process. I'd like to make just a couple of final points. First, I think we could grant more flexibility to the department with full visibility to the Congress. That would help. We need a little more authority, I believe, for reprogramming. But more importantly, I think we could give DoD some upfront discretionary money for starting programs. Obviously, again, with strict accountability to Congress. That would dramatically speed time for the initial development of a system before an appropriation cycle catches up with it. We're going to have that kind of flexibility if we're going to keep up with countries that don't operate under the same model we do. And finally, back to what I started with, I think we should be mindful of the fact that it takes a while to see the effects of change in this business. I think Congress has made some very good improvements with the WSARA and the NDAA most recently. And we've also made some very good improvements inside DoD with better buying power and the like. We should take a deep, though very watchful, breath and let the good work of the past few years in reforming acquisition take effect. We've made a lot of progress. Just look at the Virginia-class submarine as an exemplar. Let's see how the new system works for us. Once again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning, and I do look forward to your questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Admiral, there's a book that suggests that if you're tackling complex problems, you ought to start with why. Why are you doing this? What's this about? And both you and Ms. Fox kind of touched on this. The testimony we've had before this committee is, over the last year, is that probably never before in the country's history have we faced so many complex national security challenges all at the same time. While technology evolves at an increasingly rapid rate, while key competitors are making investments to deny us advantages, leading to the third offset and other initiatives at the department. And essentially, that the way the world is and the threats are moving is faster than our processes internally. So do you share that concern? Because to me, that's the why. We want to save money. We also need to get enough stuff to matter, not just have a handful of items because of cost overruns, but having the agility to keep up with technological changes and adversaries that are moving much more rapidly in some cases than we can is the bottom line of the why to me on this acquisition. Because of the position you've held, I'd like to hear your view.
Chairman, I am in violent agreement. I think you're absolutely spot on in that regard. We are going to have to be agile and quick without a haste waste makes waste phenomenon injecting itself, but we're going to have to be very agile here. And I think there are two, even though we're doing better, by the way, I think there are two contributors to why we might not be as agile as we'd like to be. One of them, candidly, is recognizing that change needs to occur in the way we approach warfighting. If somebody is going to try to deny us access to their space, we may have to try a new idea in there. And I think that's very hard for the services to do. Richard Pascal, who wrote Surfing the Edge of Chaos, said, "Equilibrium is the precursor to death." And in fact, if we find ourselves in stasis in our operational concepts, and we don't sort of wake up and say, we need to change a few things, then it's our own fault for doing that. And then the second piece is having the mechanisms in place so that when you do recognize a change is needed, that you can make it happen quickly. And I think the department is pushing hard for that, and Congress is pushing us to push hard for that, and that's the right thing. Just want to make sure we get a good, stable mechanism in place where we can actually make that happen in the right way. And there are a lot of flowers blooming. The Air Force has a terrific Rapid Capabilities Office. There's a tremendous effort going on up in the Office of the Secretary of Defense with a little group that works up there. The Vice Chairman has a small group who works for him in trying to rapidly generate SAP programs. We ought to just make sure that we empower those and that we keep an eye on them and do the best we can to make sure they're doing the right things.
Mr. Hale, Ms. Fox suggested that maybe we need a new category of acquisition because maybe we're not taking enough risk, thinking about experimentation and prototyping. I think Admiral talked about prototyping too. Okay, you've had to deal with the budget aspects of this. So what sort of challenges would we face if we thought that that was a good idea, that we needed to take some more risk in experimenting with technological, not just new technologies, but their use?
Well, I don't think the mechanical problems would be an issue, Mr. Chairman. I mean, you can authorize and appropriate funds in a category as you wish, and I don't assume you'd have to make major changes in the budget. Moreover, I suspect that usually programs are pretty inexpensive when they're starting, that this would not be a large budget issue. The problem comes when you get to the full development and especially the procurement, the budget problems. So it seems like a reasonable thing to me, and I don't see if there's agreement in Congress and hopefully also in the department. I don't see where there'd be budgetary obstacles that couldn't be surmounted.
I guess my thought was some of the pressures you have been under were, okay, everybody's under budget pressure. You see a pot of money and everybody starts grabbing for it. So it's not technical or a mechanical issue. It's more of a cultural question.
Yeah, and a senior leadership issue. I mean, if the secretary or the vice chairman and the chairman want these programs and they have a rationale for them, they'll survive the budget process. I think innovation is probably doing pretty well right now, and Secretary Carter, here I listened to his speech yesterday, he obviously feels pretty strongly on this issue. So if the senior leaders want this, I don't see budgetary obstacles. Now, the problem is going to come when you get things out of that you want to buy, and if that increases the number of those without offsets, or if we don't succeed in things like controlling, operating, and support costs, then we're going to have a problem, but not just the starting.
Yeah.
If I could add very, very briefly, one of the things that kept me awake at night in that regard was, where's the idea out there that I'm not hearing about, that I can empower? Because Bob was right. The vice chairman, the deputy, we can make things happen. It's just, where is that thing being suppressed, or it isn't getting the voice that it should have?
Yeah, good point. Ms. Fox, do you see other challenges with a new category of acquisition to encourage experimentation and prototyping like you suggested?
I do. I think the biggest challenge, honestly, is this human nature, self-incentive to be overly optimistic. And so I really do believe that if we were to follow my recommendation, it would be vitally important that the Congress continue to demand, in this case in particular, those independent cost estimates. And a good independent cost estimate, and I think the team in CAPE is excellent, needs to say, hey, there's a lot of risk here. But if you think back to some of our greatest programs, I'll just take quickly GPS as an example. We started with a program called Transit, but we quickly saw that we needed to move to something that gave us three-dimensional position information. Went to GPS. It was actually a high-risk program, and that program was almost canceled multiple times because of the risk. I don't think we were straight up at the beginning about the risk. If we all agreed it was worth it, and I think it's pretty clear that it was, then perhaps we would have been able to go forward without the constant risk of cancellation.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go back just a second to the changes in the law and the independent estimates, and just to drill down a little bit further, because I think Admiral Winnefeld, you spoke, I think maybe it was Mr. Hale that talked more about the operation and support costs, the difficulty in getting those right. What's missing, as we look at those that we need to change or build on, or
let me, if I could just, the Weapons System Acquisition Reform Act did require CAPE to stand up an operating and support cost estimating capability, and that is in progress. And from the enactment of WSARA, the ultimate operating and support costs of a program has become a part of the Defense Acquisition Boards, an explicit part. So the Congress legislated that we start doing this a while ago. The department is responding. But to echo something Admiral Winnefeld said, sometimes these things take time. And developing a good historical basis for how technology equates to operating and support costs in the fielding, it's going to take time to build up that technology, that database, so that we understand the implications of technology. So I think work is in progress, not at all to be confused with we've solved it, but the mechanisms are in place, the focus is there more than it was. Mr. Hale talked about the affordability costs, caps. I think that is a piece of it. And I agree that it needs to be a part of how Congress looks at programs, such that we're looking for that long-term implication as we field something.
When we think of innovation, I mean, we're often thinking of technology per se, and having fresh eyes on that is always helpful. I'm wondering in this area as well as perhaps in others, are we really going outside the Pentagon community, if you will, to bring that in, even in this area where private industry is looking at it a whole different way? And have we done as much as we can in that area?
No, absolutely not. And I think a key to bringing in those ideas, those innovative ideas on how to get ONS costs down, is tied back again to requirements. For a long time, it was performance that drove requirements, and you end up with a very high-performing jet engine, for example, but it uses a lot of fuel, right? So if you now crank into requirements, as Admiral Winnefeld clearly just testified he started to do, an eye toward that, then you start to mobilize industry and commercial ideas for how to innovatively get high-performance engines with lower fuel consumption. That has to be a part of our innovation process. Again, I think it's starting, but again, much more does need to be done.
May I add just one thought? I agree that it's starting. I also think there's a human nature problem here. If you're a program manager early in the life cycle of a weapon, you want to get this system going. The key to that is to keep the acquisition costs reasonable so that it gets through the early stages. The operating and support costs are 5 to 10 years out. They're somebody else's problem. And I don't want to be mean-spirited or suggest they're not thinking long range, but I do think they tend to focus more on the acquisition. I think we need pressure from within the department to pay more attention. I certainly didn't see the same interest in acquisition or in operating and support costs as I did, the same concerns about them as I did in acquisition. And maybe something like exception reporting a la the Nunn-McCurdy requirements. That said, I would first be quick to acknowledge in conversations I've had with Frank Kendall, I think bear this out, and Alan Estevez, it's hard to estimate operating and support costs early on. You're 10 years out, you have only a general idea of the design of the weapon. This isn't easy, but I think it's not impossible, and I think we need to continue to pay attention to it and probably pay more attention.
All right, thank you. And perhaps, again, I mean, getting those additional eyes on it, if that can be built in to some extent, sounds like that would certainly be helpful. Just very quickly, one of the differences perhaps we have had in moving forward is the difference in classified versus non-classified acquisition systems, et cetera. Do we handle it differently? I mean, is that rapid innovation more cultural with classified systems and less so? And what can we learn from that? How do we fuse those in a way that's responsible?
I think colloquially the way I would describe it is that the classified programs have a lot less hair on them that has to be accounted for, fewer critics that have visibility into it that can slow a program down. Yet they seem to be fairly successful programs most of the time, not always. So
What would you do?
Without getting into specifics, I think you could, it might make sense maybe to demand or encourage a study that does compare what are the characteristics of a classified program acquisition compared to an unclassified, and how could, what can you bring out that is legal, doable, makes sense in the unclassified world, and what can't you bring out? Some of those things you probably couldn't do. But I think it's a worthwhile effort to examine that, because we all have this instinct that the classified programs just work much more smoothly. Just there are fewer people involved, fewer inboxes, you know, that sort of thing.
Right.
May I add to that? While I agree that they tend to be more rapid, right, because there are fewer people involved, I think that Cape perspective is that there have been some fairly impressive failures in that category of development as well. So it isn't a total panacea, and I just would add that in the comparison. I think that the CAPE roles of looking at these systems is still important, and in most cases, but not all, CAPE did have the opportunity to look at the highly classified programs in much the same way as it looked at the other programs. But the Admiral Winnefeld is correct in that we don't have these large meetings where everybody is free to opine on the value and virtues of the program, which does make it more rapid.
And to Ms. Fox's point on failures, I mean, one of the reasons sometimes those programs are classified, it's not the only reason, is because they are so advanced. And anything that's really advanced is going to be a big challenge. So there have been challenges in those things, but there's just less bureaucracy associated with those programs.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Conway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hale, while not directly related to acquisitions per se, all of that evaluation data comes from the books and records of the Department of Defense. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your thoughts on auditing the Department of Defense, in particular the work that would have to get done to audit the roll-up of DOD writ large, as opposed to the individual pieces that are going on, and then visit with us a little bit about your perspective on transitioning to new leadership next year, and the risks to maintaining the pace and the momentum that's currently, I perceive, to be at going on with respect to the audit world.
So I never escape audit, is that the...
That's exactly right. No good deed goes unpunished.
So I remain fully convinced that, largely for public confidence reasons, it's very important for the Department of Defense to achieve auditable financial statements. I'm not involved in the day-to-day, but I believe they are making progress. I'm particularly pleased that they have auditors now involved in 3 of the services, and I think are close on the Marines for at least portions of their budget statement. And I think it's very important that we get outside auditors involved. The department will make progress and learn more. You asked about the roll-up. I don't think, although I long ago learned that this is an esoteric area where I always need help, and I don't have it anymore, but I don't think the roll-up problem will be as much of a problem within the Department of Defense, because they are carving up the pieces in a way that doesn't overlap. It will be a major problem for the government as a whole when DOD does get close to an audit and you want to turn to a full audit of the government, because there's a lot of exchanges of money that will have to be sorted out. Let me come to your last question, which I think is critical. There's several things Congress can do to help in the audit area. One is to continue constructive hearings, and I give this committee, and particularly you, Mr. Conway, a special credit for their both hearings and attention to the issue. Also, be patient. I wish DOD had started 15 years ago at this, but they didn't, at least not in the same way they've done in the last few. It's going to take a number of years to actually get there. There are significant problems. The biggest thing that worries me, though, and where you can help, is the transition, as you mentioned, to a new group of senior leaders. You know, we need to have a situation that prevailed during my tenure there, when the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy cared about this, when it was of important, obviously, the Comptroller to the new Undersecretary of Management and to the service leaderships, because they have a lot of the action now. We definitely need the new crop of political appointees to understand this is important. It'll be easier for your Senate colleagues to do this because they'll need to confirm them, but you can definitely, in my view, play a role by expressing your interest in letters and meetings and perhaps asking questions in hearings once these people get confirmed. So we need at least one more administration, and probably a couple, to actually get through all of this, and we need to make sure that it remains a high priority, and you can play a role there.
Well, thank you. Admiral, could you talk to us how at your level, the Joint Chiefs, how that tone from the top with respect to getting the audit done is communicated to lower levels in the organization? How did that work, and while you were there?
Yeah, I think the chiefs are supportive, very much so, of the audit requirement, the need to be able to audit. Most of that is done by candidly, the civilian comptroller side of the service secretariats and that sort of thing. So I don't know that the chiefs have their hands on that machinery, but my sense is that they support the need to do that. And not only because of a public accountability issue where we have to really be able to, show the books, but it help them manage their own world. I would point to the Navy, not because I'm a former Navy guy, but their former Vice Chief, Admiral Ferguson, he would hold contractor court, where he would bring in folks and really rake them over the coals to make sure that we were getting the right bang for the buck out of those contracts. And that's the sort of thing that'll benefit from having much cleaner visibility into how the money's being spent. So they're supportive of it, but they don't really have their hands on that.
Yeah, but without that support, though, those civilian folks won't react the way that that they ought to. So, well, thank you all for your long tenured service for our country. Now you go back. Thank you.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start with a rhetorical question. It's one of those to make a point, and this is not a criticism of the of the contractors or of the Navy or of DoD generally, but the Next Gen Jammer is finally, we're moving forward on that. But that thing has been Next Gen so long. I'm wondering if it's like, should be called Now Gen or Previous Gen Jammer, and the point is, this isn't even a large submarine or an aircraft carrier, right? This is a much smaller pod to put on a platform, and it taking a long time to get to a point where we can deploy. But we're getting there, and it's great. So I want to be clear about that. But the point I want to make is that, big or small, it seems that the acquisition process takes a long time, and so for you, Ms. Fox, looking at MDAPs, and is the MDAP problem a platform problem? Is it a program problem? Are there certain things in MDAPs that drive budget and timelines over set budgets and timelines? And there are things in MDAP that actually get done on time and on budget.
Thank you. On an example like Next Gen Jammer, where I completely understand your observations and frustrations, it's a capability we needed, but when it was started, it was not realistic on the technological risk. And so we're getting through it, and we are going to have a capable jammer, and we need it. But some of the advanced electronics and the need to miniaturize them and the threat advances that have happened during the course of that program, all of which combines to make it take longer than we wanted. So I think that the MDAP programs, again, it all starts well when we all have shared expectations of both need and risk, and that gets to time and cost and the technological risk. And that's what I think we have worked hard to improve. But in places like the Next Gen Jammer, we did not cancel that program. We've worked through those problems. But that's the big thing. MDAPs tend to last for a very long time. So it is really important, in my opinion, that we go through the process to get to a system that we want to last for a very long time, that's sustainable, affordably, and upgradable. Those are all aspects of MDAPs that need to be considered and that do take the time. But I think we can avoid our disappointments if we are more realistic at the beginning.
It seems to me, though, the problem is part of what makes an MDAP sustainable is us. It may not be affordable, but we sustain it. That is, we end up rewarding it being over budget and not meeting the schedule by keeping it going because we need it. But so there's no incentive on the front end to get it as right as we need it if we continue it despite what happens later.
You know, I think that, my opinion, the Nunn-McCurdy process has actually done a lot to push on that problem. I can tell you right now, so from a CAPE perspective, we didn't hate Nunn-McCurdy's. We thought they forced a process of looking at things critically. Of course, CAPE had a big role in Nunn-McCurdy's, and I think we tried hard to play that role. But I can tell you, the services hate Nunn-McCurdy's. I mean, they will do anything they can now to get a program started such that they don't Nunn-McCurdy because of the challenges of starting over, right? The assumption of cancellation. And that has made a big difference. So again, I think there are things now in place that help us with the very problems that you're targeting that we need to continue to push on, but that over time are making a difference. And I at least certainly saw that in my time. When I got there, we had a lot of Nunn-McCurdy's to work through. It took a lot of time. It forced us to scrutinize these programs in new ways. There's not very many now. People don't like them. It's good. They shouldn't.
Yeah, well, I guess my question about whether or not you can build affordability into, as a goal that's more than rhetorical.
Well, it requires you to be willing throughout the entire process to trade requirements for affordability as you develop the program. And that is exactly the collaboration that Admiral Winnefeld talked about, that I referred to, and that I think is going on with these affordability caps and must continue.
All right, well, I think I heard you use Nunn-McCurdy as a verb, so I guess we've advanced a long way if it's now a verb. So.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. I appreciate the strong commitment of Chairman Mac Thornberry on acquisition reform and his persistence. As chairman of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, my greatest concern has been and will be getting the newest and most effective technology to the warfighter to protect against cyber attacks. Do you believe that our current construct allows for this, and how do you believe rapid acquisition might play a role in achieving this goal? And also, does this promote public-private cooperation?
I would say that we, sir, we have built into the requirements process the essentially cybersecurity of programs, that they be resistant to that. I worry less about the program itself than I worry about the people who are building it and their networks, candidly. And I think we're making some progress in that regard to hold our cleared defense contractors accountable for the security of their networks so that we don't lose our technology to a potential adversary. But we're very mindful of the need for and not just, internet cybersecurity. I mean the overall security of the electronics in that platform, which could be potentially quite vulnerable. So we are paying attention to that. I presume that's continuing on after I've left. But it's a valid concern. It is a singular vulnerability that we have. It's a new vulnerability that we have to watch for.
And I appreciate the efforts of Secretary Ash Carter to visit Silicon Valley, to meet with leaders of IT and as to what can be done to facilitate, again, the most effective and up-to-date capabilities. And for each of you, could you give us an example of the best practice that the Department of Defense acquisition community should be following to improve how they start programs? And can you name a program where they've actually been used in practice, beginning with Ms. Fox?
I believe that, as I've said, the best practice is honest realism. And I think that I'm going to say this and probably with some trepidation, I think the process we have attempted to use to start the new bomber really worked hard at looking hard at requirements, needs, and affordability. It was, in my experience, in my time, the first one to have an affordability cap written into the direction from then Secretary Gates to the Secretary of the Air Force. It explicitly directed this trade-off throughout the course of the program between requirements and costs. So I think there were some efforts taken there that have the potential to have started that program well. We'll see as it goes forward.
Thank you.
So I'll stay on my soapbox and say I think a best practice needs to continue to look for better ways to control the growth in operating and support costs. Not that the department hasn't done anything, they definitely have, and the affordability caps provide a forum for that debate. I can't tell you a program where this has worked well. I'm not close enough to it now. I can tell you one where I think it's important, and that would be the Bradley Fighting Vehicle replacement. As the Army develops this, they'll buy it in hopefully very large numbers, and so it will have some substantial effects on operating and support costs. So I think that is one where they definitely need to pay close attention to the affordability cap and the operating and support cost portions of it.
So there are probably a number of best practices to talk about, but in regards to the ability to field things quickly when the warfighter needs them, we've instituted the GONS and the JUONS process. The JUONS is a Joint Urgent Operational Needs Statement. Give you a couple of examples of that. During the Ebola epidemic, Transportation Command submitted a Joint Urgent Operational Needs requirement in October of 2014. That was validated as a requirement by the JROC in October of 2014, and it was delivered in March of 15. And that gave us the capability to transport Ebola patients safely on DoD aircraft. Another example of that would be a full-motion video dissemination system that was submitted by CENTCOM in December of 14. It was validated in January of 15, within that 30-day window I talked about. And its initial operational capability was May of last year, and they have 3 systems up and running as of September last year. So that's the urgent side. The middle ground, which is really sort of challenging for us, is the Joint Emergent Operational Needs Statement, which is something you don't have to have it tomorrow because to protect a warfighter in something that's ongoing. But this is an imminent conflict where we really need to get something moving quickly. And we have responded to a Central Command request for real-time ID capability that was validated in November of 14, and its initial operating capability will be this June, within that this 2-year period. So I think what we're doing is we're working hard to unveil best practices as we find them and to try to accelerate things when the warfighter really needs them.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Bodello.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question would be to former Deputy Secretary Hale. I look forward to seeing progress and fielding the long-range strike bomber, a capability that we certainly need. So as we look forward in the acquisition process, can you speak to how we can apply lessons learned to keep what will be a long-term program in check, time and cost-wise?
I think I'm going to refer to the former Deputy Secretary.
Ms. Fox.
Thank you. I agree completely about the importance of the new bomber. And as I referred to a minute ago, the initial start of that program specifically suggested that the department needs to debate throughout the course of the program affordability and requirements to make sure the department gets the capability it needs, but that it stays affordable such that the department can buy it in sufficient numbers. So we have both capability and quantity. And I think that the most important thing is that dialogue continue. I think that the 2016 NDAA has things in there that will enhance the dialogue, or Admiral Winnefeld pointed out that opportunity already existed, and I completely agree with that, but I think the legislation pushes more for that kind of collaborative dialogue throughout the course of the program. But the Joint Staff, the Military Department, and OSD, and industry needs to constantly be talking about these trade-offs as it goes forward, such that we get a bomber, a timely bomber, that's also capable and that is affordable enough to buy in numbers.
I don't know if you mentioned the time, but I also asked for cost-wise.
So there is actually an affordability cap on the bomber, or at least there was when I was there. I can't say that I'm current anymore, but there was a cost cap on that, and that is directly related to the time to field. So I believe that the intent is there for time, cost, requirement trade-offs to go through the process. I think that the thing that the Congress can look for is that dialogue happening, and if any of those requirements are changing, why? And is there a justified need? So that, again, it's all about keeping eyes open so that we know what we're getting into. And there was an attempt at the beginning of that program to put that kind of eyes open trade-offs into the process.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. You all had mentioned affordability. I want to ask a question in that realm. It seems like where affordability goals have been used, they've been successful. I have a question, though, or a direction in how they're being utilized. Are they being used across all acquisition programs? Are they being used early in the program's life? Are they managed by someone at a senior level, at a deputy level, who has oversight over all the aspects of the program, requirements, budgeting, program management, acquisition? So I guess my question is this, is how often does DoD use affordability constraints or goals in the management of a process? And should those affordability goals be inserted at milestone A so they can have an effect early on in the process? So I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Well, I think right now there's, according to the September 2015 report, again, I don't have up-to-date information. They said there were 29 caps. They said it was about 29 or 70%, I should say, of the MDEP programs had them. I think most of them are put in place as you get near milestone B, and because I think you have a better sense then of a weapon that you can cost out. Some of them precede milestone B. They didn't get a lot of attention in the September 2015 report. There has been one page describing them, but they are also, I think, relatively new. And so I think, as I said, I believe this is an area where Congress should continue to ask questions of the DoD witnesses that come before them as to how well they're doing at both implementing and enforcing them. And as you've heard me say several times, I would pay particular attention to the operating and support cost portions of those caps, since I think they're newer, harder to do, and probably don't get quite as much attention as the acquisition side. Either of you want to add to that?
If I may, I would like to add. So I do think Secretary Hale said that they're new. So I think we need to give it time. The bomber example is one that's a little further along. However, I would want to go back to emphasize, in my view, the importance of the conversation about affordability goals early and throughout. Because if you stick strictly to the affordability caps, you may be trading capability throughout that makes the program less valuable when it's ultimately fielded. This gets back to the risk discussion that we had earlier. Sometimes I worry that in the interest of the pendulum swings, right? So we were taking nothing but risk and had terrible red cost and schedule situations. We don't want it to go so far back the other way that we squeeze all the risk out and therefore we've got affordability caps, but we don't end up with programs that actually advance capability. So it's a conversation. Congress has to be a part of the conversation, in my view, transparent, but eyes open.
Sure. Yeah, well, let me ask this. The whole idea of affordability, I think, has to include the concept of value. And if you do that, it has to start in the program writing process to make sure there's continuity there, to the process where you get to a proposal, to the process where you get to program managers. And there's a stovepiping of that happens right now. So along the way, affordability might get mentioned or value might get mentioned, but it doesn't continue through the process. That's why I think the question, Admiral Winnefeld, I'd love to have your perspective there since you've served at that level. How important is it for senior decision makers at the deputy secretary level to look at the continuity of this, to make sure that if we're going to use affordability as a part of that value transfers from stovepipe to stovepipe, from requirements to proposal writing to program management to acquisition?
First of all, it's about communication, it's about inclusion, making sure you've got the right people in the right meetings. I do think that if the value is represented by whether the requirement is being achieved, or the distance between threshold and objective, or however you want to characterize it, I think that does get carried through the process. And in fact, as the JROC, we would not just sort of hand off a requirement and wash our hands and somebody else's problem. We would get frequent briefs. For example, I got a brief every 6 months on the F-35 that was very detailed on the status of that program in front of the entire JROC and the advisors. And so we would be able to assess whether the value was being retained as the program marched through its various progress. It's an important goal you're stating, that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of that as you're focused now on manufacturability and cost and O&S and that sort of thing. But I think we're okay there. It's just something that senior leadership, as you point out, needs to keep an eye on.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, ma'am, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Admiral Winnefeld, had the opportunity to watch my Bulldogs whip up on the Yellow Jackets this year, and I don't know if you made it to the game or not, but it's usually a pretty good one. Couldn't help it. But I know you've been affiliated with Georgia Tech for a long time, and hope to see you there in short order. And I just wonder, as I listen to things and look at the way things happen in Washington, if the fear of failure sometimes isn't stronger than the desire to succeed. And when we get into things at the Pentagon, it seems that the getting something that's good enough ends up with so much criticism that we strive for something that in some cases isn't attainable, and we spend a lot of money getting nowhere. I look back at the purchase of the F-22 and what happened there, and I think right now we'd be very happy to have more F-22s. But I've watched, the one program that I've had the most experience with has been the JSTARS. It was something that we were looking at the recapitalization of this when I got here. Certainly it seems that we're starting to move further forward with this. And the recap long-term is estimated to save $11 billion in operating and sustainment over 20 years. And when we look, we've waited so long now, we know we're going to have a capability gap with that intelligence platform. Is there enough emphasis on the making sure that those major acquisition programs stay on schedule? I guess is my primary question.
So again, I do believe that the schedule part of the Nunn-McCurdy legislation puts a point on it, for sure. I also think schedule and cost are so intertwined that the cost overrun aspects of it are so tied to schedule that that's a concern. But I take your point, and I just have to hearken to Secretary Hale's point about the budget pressures, which I know this committee also wrestles with. When you have this kind of budget pressure and uncertainty, the department responds by what we call slips and slides. We slip and slide programs, which stretches schedule, stretches and adds cost, and it's what the program does in response to wanting to being over-programmed, but having genuine needs. JSTARS is a good example, I think. So this budget environment it is very difficult, frankly, for maintaining cost and schedule. And the department is slipping and sliding. I think that there's a lot of oversight to try to prevent that as much as possible every year through program review, but I can tell you from personal experience, every year in program review, we slip and slide things. And every time you do that, you add cost and schedule. Budget predictability is critical, and adequate budget to support the operations that the department needs to do, the size of the force that goes with that, and then modernization. It's all part of the package.
I just want to underscore that, and I do so in full recognition that this committee has actually tried very, very hard to get that stability into the budget that Mr. Hale talked about, both under Chairman McKeon and under Chairman Thornberry. So please keep that going. But it would break your heart to sit in on some of these, what we call DMAGs, Deputies Management Action Groups, and look at the trades that are having to be made with these literally budget line items from year to year that are shifting around constantly because of the churn in the budget. Not having, first of all, 3/4 of a year's worth of time to work because the NDAA doesn't get passed, or the appropriations thing doesn't get passed until the end of the year. And then only having 2 years of predictability, it just introduces incredible turbulence and churn into these programs. And we literally sit there at the table and you're moving numbers around and you can just see the breakage about to happen in these programs. It's an underestimated impact.
So I would just point out that, and you know this, but the acquisition cost of the first unit is a lot different than what it takes to produce the second one. And I just wonder if some of the accounting that gets done at GAO and other areas, if they're pricing technology as a variable cost instead of as a fixed cost, because once it's been sunk into a new weapon system, it's gone. Thank you for being here, and hope to see you in Georgia.
Admiral, there's, I think all of you have expressed some support for affordability caps or goals. One of the concerns that I've heard is that, okay, if you start out with this affordability goal, then the military is going to dial back the requirements to fit within the affordability goal. And so what's your view about that concern? Not really saying what they need, but just trying to try to calibrate what they can get?
It's a good question, and I would say at the front end of that process, the WSARA asked us to consider cost when we were formulating requirements. It didn't say you have to put a cost cap on. It didn't say, you know, that should be the principal and only variable when you're considering a requirement. It just said consider it. And I think that we've taken a mature approach to that, looked at it as I think the spirit of Congress intended, and that is, look, don't give us a gold-plated requirement that's just going to be unrealistic from the start. That was doomed to failure either from a cost perspective because of the technical risk or what have you. And I think I don't have any examples at the tip of my fingers. It's been too long since I've been there, but I do recall several times when we said, you know, we just got to be really careful here. This technology is tight, and you know, we're going to have to maybe dial either back the timeline or the actual requirement itself. But I don't know that it ever really had a major impact on what a warfighter was looking for. And then there's the whole process of threshold and objective that builds in a little bit of flexibility there for what, you know, a stretch goal for the requirement. You know, try to achieve that, but trying to hop across that threshold and get there successfully. The thing I worry about with program managers who are paid to spend every last dollar getting as far as they can from the threshold to the objective, there's a knee in the curve there somewhere, and we ought to reward those folks when they come back and say, you know, I could spend 90% of this money just getting another 2% towards the objective. Maybe reward them when they take a better approach than that.
Yeah, and I want to, go ahead.
There's two sides to this coin, and we need innovation for sure, and I think Secretary Carter made that clear yesterday and is getting emphasis. But we also, when we develop something innovative, need to have balanced the cost versus the requirements in a way that we can buy a reasonable number of them and pay to operate them. So I think the affordability caps don't need to stifle innovation, much of which occurs before they're set. I hope that they will help the department make trade-offs so that it gets reasonable numbers of these weapons and not the B-2 sort of situation when we bought, what, 21 of them. And I hope we don't do that with this bomber.
Yeah, me too. Mr. Hale, message received on operation and support costs. Do you think it is feasible to have some sort of cost goals or caps for pure services that the department contracts for, which is an increasing part, as you well know, of the department's budget?
So that's a good question, and not one I've thought about a lot. I think it is worth thinking about. It probably would have, I mean, for some cases and services where we do fixed price contracts, we have one, but many of them are not, and that probably deserves some more thought. I mean, perhaps I could ask Dr. Fox here if she has thoughts on that one, since I don't have anything really good to say.
It's not, Doctor, but that's okay. Thank you for the compliment. Okay, service costs. Yes, you know, it all gets down to the number of efficiency reviews that the department has done, and I saw Secretary Carter's speech yesterday, apparently continues to do, and service costs are a key part of that. So there's two really hard things about this, if I could. One is you really need to understand what we need these people to do. So if you want to take out service costs, we want to make sure that we're understanding that we might have to take out things that they are doing and look at the products, the services they provide. And then the other side, which is really far from that, is management. Because a lot of them are maybe not doing critical things, right? There may be, we've just let the services grow. So you have this very hard, detailed work that is required to trade off, to look hard at, have we grown because things grow, and so you need to push that down, which we always need to do. And then you get to a point, and in some areas of services in DoD, I believe that there are points where you've gone too far. And then you start to see people in uniform performing services that it would be far better and cheaper to have contractors perform. So what does it all come down to? A lot of hard, detailed work. You have to peel it all back, ask what are they doing, is it managed well? It's constant, you've got to be vigilant about it. I certainly think for the 3 secretaries I had the privilege to work for, they pounded on me and us to do that, and it's constantly needed. And so keep pounding is my best answer, sorry.
With a moment to think, let me add a thought, and that is some significant contracts occur in the support of weapons systems, and I think if we find ways to shine a bit more of a spotlight on O&S costs, which I think is starting to happen, but continue that, we will accomplish some of the goal of trading off contracts for services as well as other aspects of operating and support costs. But it's a good question, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Fox, you mentioned at one point earlier today about the incentives of the program managers to do certain things. One of the conclusions that I think most of us have reached as we have looked at acquisition is that is really crucial. You know, we can pass whatever laws we want to, but it is the incentives for the decision makers that really control the outcome. Do you have any other thoughts or guidance for us on incentives that may not be operating in the way that lead to the results we want?
So I agree with you completely. I think the incentives have moved with the emphasis on starting programs well, but there still are an enormous number of incentives in the system that start from how people are assigned, to how long they're assigned, to how they're promoted and rewarded, that are all about the momentum of the process. So, for example, one of the aspects of the acquisition process, so you get a program manager who's trying to get to that next milestone, that's their incentive, or they're incentivized to do that, and they find a better way. A contractor comes along with some new idea, or there's some new innovation. Their incentive is not to say, whoop, wait, stop, let's do that, because what they're looking at are all the things they have to do to get it right back to where it is right now in the process. So the things that this committee is doing, the things that I think Secretary Kendall is trying hard to do in streamlining the acquisition process, those are all necessary parts to incentivize people to do smart things along the way. And right now those incentives aren't there because it just feels like they're pushing a boulder up the hill. And they don't want to lose ground.
Well, I think back to keep pounding away, that's one of the areas where we do need to understand what it's like to be doing that day to day and try to improve. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I think as you were speaking, Ms. Fox, sometimes we know what people do, but asking why we're asking them to do it is different, and sometimes that's a little harder to incorporate. We have a better budget right now in terms of predictions. I mean, there's a little bit more predictability in the budget, and I hope that's correct. And I'm wondering, is there a way of tracking, if you will, how people are performing, how we're doing as a result of that, and being able to go back so that future Congresses will see the difference? And I'm really some metrics that get a handle on the impact, the consequences of doing things in a more predictable fashion. Is this a good time to look at that? What would those metrics look like?
So absolutely, this is a good time to look at that. My answer is not restricted to this time. This is a historical view, and one of CAPE's roles, is to collect that data over time. And they do that well, and they should be continued to do that well and be required to do that. Because without historical data, you can't do the very important thing that you just suggested. I will refer you, if I could, to a study done by Dave McNichols, who used to be the cost director in PA&E formerly and is now at the Institute for Defense Analyses. And he did exactly the study you're suggesting, where he tried to correlate the performance of programs to different acquisition reform initiatives. And interestingly, in a nutshell, he found that not much correlation there, but a very strong correlation to precipitous budget drops. Whenever the budget dropped or became very uncertain, the department went into that slips and slides method that I referred to earlier, and that's when the costs started to grow. So he did that long-term view that reinforces exactly the question that you're asking, and I do hope that we are starting a new period of predictability such that we can recover that and get back to performance predictions and achieving the best that we can.
You know, it might be interesting sometime, and I hope I don't put my former DoD colleagues on the spot on this, but to just have them bring maybe one slide over from one of these decision briefs that we have to show you the kind of puts and takes that they're looking at with budget uncertainty. Well, you know, we have option A, option B, option C, option D, and what all those little options do to crunch the program, and you know, if you have to save X amount of money, what it really does. That might be sort of, just maybe for a small group, maybe for the chairman and ranking member and some staffers to just kind of walk through that process and see what people are going through.
So I would just add, we have some predictability for 2017, and I'm thankful for that. Although I think the issue of OCO will arise and may affect that. 2018, we're potentially back in the soup, and there needs to be a broad budget deal in a new administration that looks beyond just discretionary spending, but also at entitlements and probably revenues as well, and tries to get rid of this MEDEX sequester that was put in place by the Budget Control Act, and I hope that happens. It hasn't been debated much so far, but I hope that it does get debated and that it happens in a new administration.
Great, thank you.
For what it's worth, I hope it happens too. And I hope that the stability we thought we were achieving last year is the stability that we do achieve this year, regardless of the increased operational costs, which, you know, are a fact given the way the world is moving. So, Mr. Veazey, you have a question? You good? Mr. Lamborn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having this important hearing. And thank you all for your contributions. Former Admiral Winnefeld, I want to ask you in particular, and by the way, thank you for your distinguished service, and it was good to get to know you when you came to Colorado Springs. As the chairman's designee heading the JROC, how do you feel the current service-led acquisition system serves national requirements, including nuclear forces, NC3, space, and missile defense? Are these capabilities service priorities?
I think they are becoming more and more a service priority. I think we're on a good trajectory there. We were not several years ago. But I think the senior leadership within the services, particularly the Air Force and the Navy, who are most concerned with the particular programs you're talking about, have really stepped up recently. They've had some encouragement from a number of forums. Frank Kendall, the head of AT&L, and I co-chaired a forum on the command and control system, nuclear command and control system that brought all the stakeholders together in a very cooperative fashion and tried to stitch things together there. I think the Deputy Secretary Fox, when she was in power, and also Deputy Secretary Work have put a lot of emphasis on that, and I personally put a lot of emphasis on this. And the service secretaries and chiefs have responded very well, and they knew that this needed to happen. I think we're on a much better trajectory, I would tell you, than we were a couple of years ago in the nuclear command and control arena.
Excellent. That's great to hear. And kind of a follow-up, can you explain why strategic missile warning, ITWA, is important? Should this capability be considered a part of NC3 as opposed to a space system, which it currently is?
First of all, it's important because it links the sensors that would detect a missile launch or other thermal event to the people who need that information, the command and control leadership. So it's a very, very important system. I'm not convinced that it belongs in the nuclear command and control system. It's a space system, just like GPS is a space system. People who are space savvy, both on the technical side and the operational side, probably ought to be the ones running it, and in some cases, those platforms ride on other platforms as well. I don't think there's any harm in leaving it where it is, and I think you've actually got maybe right now really good ownership of the space piece. We've got a very good trajectory also on the space executive agent inside DOD, the Secretary of the Air Force. So I would tend to not want to tamper with that, but it is something that we've got to pay very close attention to, because I always say the most vital national security interest of the United States is the survival of the nation. And being able to detect somebody who's threatening that with a missile launch is absolutely critical, so we got to make sure we pay close attention to it.
Okay, well, thank you. And as another follow-up, have you seen the Air Force apply appropriate priority to its modernization?
This falls back into your first question, where they're on a better trajectory, I think, than they were several years ago. They've stepped up to the plate. They realize that. I haven't been in for 6 months to look at where it actually fell out in this year's budget, so I can't make an assessment there. But I sensed as I was leaving that they were strongly committed to that program. So it'd be interesting to see what pops out in the budget. I lost visibility over that 6 months ago.
Okay.
Sure.
Now, what would you tell Air Force senior leadership if someone were to suggest that, well, we can trade 1 or 2 minutes worth of missile warning time in exchange for saving some budget resources which we can apply elsewhere? What kind of trade-off would you consider that?
The only trade-off I would consider is to get 1 or 2 more minutes of warning time in that regard. We need everything we can get there. It's, again, a critical element of the defense of this nation from the most catastrophic attack you can have, and I wouldn't want to trade any time. Obviously, if somebody said, well, it's going to cost you $1 trillion unless you accept this 1 minute, and, there's always, every man has his price, I suppose, but I really would be reluctant to consider any decrease in the amount of warning time we give the president in relation to an attack on this country.
Okay. And Mr. Hale, Ms. Fox, in the short time we have left, do you have any observations on our dialogue?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
I would just add that I completely agree with Admiral Winnefeld. These are critically important areas. I think that the department is focusing on them more and needs to continue to do that, and resources are going to be required to modernize these important areas in the future, and it's going to continue to be a stress on the budget, more so.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Feasy?
I did have one question that I wanted to ask the panel. As far as acquisition reform is concerned, and someone may have already asked this, so if they have, please forgive that. But if there was one area of reform that you could pick, and you could only pick one, like where would it be? And it could be a policy or a technique or anything that would just maybe be the beginning of something really good as far as acquisition reform is concerned.
I would think about how to add back risk into the equation of acquisition programs with eyes open, making sure that we completely understand the cost and schedule implications of that risk. But that is the one aspect of reform that I think we haven't focused enough on, since we've done so much good and important work on swinging us back to predictable programs. I think now we need to worry just a little bit about whether we've become too risk averse.
Well, as I said in my statement, I would try to build on the framework the department has to do a better job of controlling operating and support costs, because they're so important to the budget, 2/3 of the total defense budget, more than half of the life cycle cost of weapons. We've got a framework to do that, and this affordability caps that the department has used, I think it needs more attention and effort to try to control these costs.
And while absolutely agreeing with what my two colleagues have said, because those are very important, I would at least potentially open a dialogue with the department, including AT&L and the Comptroller and CAPE, on does it make sense to provide discretionary money up front to the department so that they can accelerate development of programs once the requirement's been established. So you can visualize in rough, crude terms that a requirement hits the street, now we've got a budget for it, And because of our cycle process, it's a one and a half or 2 years before the thing really gets money. If there were a pool of money where we could actually accelerate development in that space, you might actually bring some of these programs forward significantly in time at relatively low cost. Just eliminating that waiting game for the budget to catch up to the requirement would probably be something at least to entertain a dialogue with the department on.
If I could just add to the importance of the access to money, I do believe that the NDAA includes a rapid prototyping and fielding fund, if I read it correctly. Not really sure that I appreciate exactly how that will be implemented, but ideas like that to allow the department to do the kinds of things Admiral Winnefeld suggested, I think, are critically important to increasing our ability to get new ideas out to the operators.
And just to amplify, I think Ms. Fox would agree with me. We really are talking about two different things here. One is a pool of money for rapidly experimenting with new ideas and seeing if they bear fruit and then turning those into programs. The other thing is maybe even a stable, fairly vanilla program that just is running through its life cycle and not having to wait that year and a half or two to get it started. It doesn't take much money to get these things going. But if you're having to wait that year and a half just pro forma because of our process, then you're losing time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks, do you have questions?
Acquisition reform is something that we need as a matter of good government, but I would submit further that it is very quickly becoming a matter of financial necessity. I'm not sure if you've seen the kind of economic financial data that we've been seeing in Congress, but it's taken a dramatic turn for the worse. By way of background, I was elected in 2010. Since 2010, one of the things that the Republicans in Congress could at least point to is every single year the deficit got lower, i.e. better, still horrible, at $439 billion, which was last year's deficit, but that's a whole lot better than the string of trillion-dollar deficits that we had. In the first quarter of this fiscal year, revenue has been up 4%, which is a good thing, but spending went up 7%. According to the Treasury Department, this first fiscal year, we had a $36 billion worsening of our deficit situation compared to the first quarter of the previous fiscal year. By extrapolation, that would suggest that we're going to have a $144 billion deficit, worse than what we had in a bad $439 billion deficit last year. However, the CBO is a little bit more optimistic, saying, well, we think it'll only be $130-something billion worse, putting it somewhere in the neighborhood of $570 billion. They're also telling us that while we blew through the $19 trillion debt mark recently, within a decade, we're going to blow through the $30 trillion debt mark, which means that we're looking at a 10-year average of over $1 trillion a year in deficits. That being the case, what is your judgment that the Pentagon is really serious about streamlining acquisition efforts through the federal acquisition regulations, changing that or what have you, in order to maximize the bang for the buck that the taxpayer has to allocate to national security?
Well, my evidence is a little out of date, but I think they are serious, and I think they have made some progress in important areas of acquisition reform. To go to your broader statement, Mr. Brooks, we need a broad budget discussion in this country, not just the discretionary spending, not just defense and the non-defense discretionary spending, which make up about 30% of our spending, as I think you know. We need to get at the other 70%, entitlements, mandatory spending, and interest on the debt, and probably revenues as well. And as I said earlier, I hope that in a new administration we see a broad budget deal that goes beyond. I might add Alice Rivlin, who I worked for many years ago and I have great respect for, working, I think, with Senator Pete Domenici, suggested that what Congress ought to do is start authorizing and appropriating entitlement funds so that you don't just focus on the discretionary spending, but that you focus on closer to 100% of what the government spends. I think that would be a good process reform, but we need substantive reform and a budget deal.
But you're telling me that you're optimistic that the Pentagon is in fact going to start becoming better at streamlining the acquisition process?
Well, I think there are measures that suggest they've already had some success, and again, I invite my colleague.
Okay, any chance that there would be dramatic success of the kind needed to reflect the worsening financial condition of the United States of America?
I don't know if you call it dramatic or not, but I think they have made progress.
Anybody else want to add any insight on that? If not, I'll go to my second question. Okay, Mr. Fox, a lot of discussion today has focused on affordability constraints. If affordability goals were required in Milestone A for all programs, it would force conversations and coordination early in the acquisition process. Mr. Fox, can you please, Ms. Fox, misreading my notes here, can you please speak to the accuracy of cost estimates early in the process? Is there enough fidelity to inform affordability goals at Milestone A?
I believe that the accuracy of the independent cost estimates have shown consistently that the ICEs are more right than wrong over time, and I believe that the more data that they have, the more accurate that they are. I think that there's been a tremendous amount of progress in bringing independent cost estimates to the Milestone A discussion and the conversation in the Department of Trade-offs between requirements and costs. So I believe that those changes are in fact taking place and have been taking place for a few years now. I think that it may take time for that to play through so that it's more visible, but I believe that those changes have been made and that the independent cost estimates are having impact.
Well, Mr. Hale and Ms. Fox, thank you for your responses, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Great. Thank you all, not only for being here today, but for the many ways that each of you has served the country. I have one other favor. As we did last year, we're going to introduce a standalone bill on acquisition reform this year in March. And the idea is that the people who deal with the acquisition system have experience and insights, can give us feedback about how it can be improved before we actually mark up the defense authorization bill for this year. So to the extent you are looking for something to do some Saturday night, if you have some suggestions when we release that, your feedback to the committee, further feedback to the committee would be very much appreciated. So again, thank you all for being here. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.